You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 8th of May 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up on today's programme, EU members discuss more sanctions for Russia, but will this 14th package be the one that makes all the difference? Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida visits South America to bolster ties as China's influence across the Pacific grows. Plus, why they're making a Swiss Army knife without the knife, and a roundup of the day's latest business news. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Vincent McAviney. EU ambassadors are meeting today to discuss a new round of sanctions on Russia. This would be the 14th package since the country's illegal invasion of Ukraine, this time focusing on restricting Moscow's profits from the supply of liquefied natural gas. Well, let's get more on this with Michael Binion, foreign affairs specialist for The Times, who joins us from here in London, and from Brussels with Koen Verhelst, who's a trade reporter for Politico Europe. Michael, firstly, are the 27 members still as unified when it comes to sanctions?
Well, more or less, but of course we never quite know how the Hungarian ambassador will vote, because Hungary has been firmly opposed to many of the sanctions and has gone along only reluctantly with many of the EU measures trying to help Ukraine. So it's not quite clear whether he will simply be outvoted or whether he will not cast a vote or how he will decide. But generally, all the others are united in feeling that they do need to do something more demonstrative in supporting Ukraine, more effective in depriving Russia of profits from trade of some kind with the outside world.
And Koen, with those intentions in mind, what do we expect this package to involve?
So one of the things is that LNG, liquefied natural gas, is still exported from Russia. This is not sanctioned at all currently, and this is imported by Belgium and Spain, for instance, and France as well. And in those countries, it's put into different ships and then exported elsewhere to third countries outside the EU. So this is a thing that the European Commission, sort of the day-to-day, let's say, executive branch, they have proposed to stop this, to say, okay, these transshipments, they need to end. You know, we can still import maybe some liquefied natural gas from Russia for our own needs if we need to, fix our stocks for the coming winter, but this transshipment really needs to end. And then there's a couple of smaller measures as well.
It's very surprising that, if most people thinking we all know the problems with the energy transition in Europe. When I saw that France, Belgium and Spain were still reliant on Russian gas, I thought it was for domestic purposes. But you're saying it's just purely for export. Why have they not sort of closed that down already?
It's not purely for export. And Spain has a lot of LNG terminals. They also then re-export it to Italy or to Germany, for instance. So there is a lot of internal haggling. But yeah, indeed, like a big chunk of what comes in through these liquefied gas ships, that actually goes to third countries. And the trick is, of course, that it's been a very lucrative business for industries in those countries, and they still need gas often to run industrial processes. So there is still a need for gas in Europe. There's been such a reliance for so long, especially on the manufacturing side, that this is something that is not so easily switched away from.
Michael, EU firms would also possibly be banned from investing in new gas projects in Russia. Would this have much of an impact, or could they turn to other allies like China to supply this?
I think the Russians have already discounted the idea that there's going to be any EU investment or any major energy company hoping to help Russia in its construction of new gas facilities. So I think they will already be looking elsewhere. China, possibly, yes, because the majority of regular gas from Russia is now being switched to China, if possible, and to other countries such as India and other places willing to take the gas. The Russians have a certain amount of pretty good technology of their own for this, but they can easily look for expert help from elsewhere. And I think they're certainly not counting on either EU investment funds or EU expertise to set up any new terminals and plants that they need to.
And Michael, ambassadors will also discuss restrictions for political parties accepting money from Russia and its proxies. How much of an issue is this right now across the continent?
Well, it's rather peculiar. I mean, these funds for political parties are pretty much clandestine in any case. Most political parties are rather shy about announcing how much Kremlin money they're taking. But it's known that Russia has supported particularly far right-wing groups. For some reason, they seem to think that the right wing, well, which is proving true, is less hostile to Russia and more friendly to Russian aims in Ukraine than most other political parties. How much has been going to them, it's not clear. And certainly how much is going to media companies in Western Europe is also not clear. The amounts can't be very big. I mean, certainly there were quite a large amount of funds going to, Marine Le Pen, for example. Her party, National Rally, has been receiving Russian money, but I think that's pretty much dried up now.
And Kuhn, as mentioned there are several media outlets that are going to face sanctions. What do we know about these and what have they been putting out?
The most high profile of these is Voice of Europe. This is an outlet that was based up until recently in the Czech Republic, and the Czech Secret Service basically raided the offices and said, "Hey, this is a propaganda, a disinformation outlet financed and directed from Russia by the Kremlin." And it looked like a legitimate news site, and the Czechs have also said, and this is really what has informed this discussion on financing for political parties, is that they claim that politicians in Belgium and also in the Netherlands and potentially in other countries have been receiving money through Voice of Europe to basically tout Kremlin talking points, like just say, oh, NATO expanded too fast, or Ukraine is fascist, these kind of things. And there have on top of that, and this is separate, I should note, but there have been some investigations in a German far-right politician recently who is in the European Parliament. One of his assistants got arrested, for instance, for on suspicion on spying for China. So there are a few of these issues that have cropped up in recent weeks. And then of course on top of that, in a few weeks' time, about a month from now, all of Europe will head to the polls to vote for a new European Parliament for the next 5 years. So the timing is of the essence to get to make clear to European parties all over the continent that they cannot accept any money from the Kremlin.
And Michael, final question. An issue on the minds of a lot of voters across Europe that's brought out a lot of passion is the Israel-Gaza war. Are we going to see, do you think, anything today from the EU ambassadors on that front?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, the European Union has already made it clear that they are very strongly opposed to an Israeli occupation of Rafah. That appears to have started already, and already the Israelis are urging, or more or less telling, the Palestinians, you must leave, you must go some kilometers away from the Rafah crossing point. That's causing enormous anger and upset, not only among the Arab countries, but in many European countries that have warned Israel not to go ahead with this because of the huge human cost it will involve. Now, whether the Europeans can do more than simply deplore it or call on Israel to show restraint, I doubt if they'll start talking about actual financial or other political measures to target Israel on this. I don't think that's what they're up to, but they certainly will probably call for a halt to any further military escalation in that area.
Michael Binion from The Times in London and Koen Verhelst from Politico Europe in Brussels, thank you for joining us. Now here's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Vincent. The United States has halted a shipment of weapons to Israel as Washington continues to put pressure on its ally to avoid a full-scale invasion of Rafah in Gaza. It comes as Israel and Hamas officials continue negotiations in Cairo in order to reach a ceasefire for hostages deal. The United Nations has warned a full-scale assault on Rafah would be a humanitarian catastrophe. In Brazil, 90 people have been reported dead following devastating floods across the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul. Dozens of people are stranded and still waiting to be evacuated, with the flooding hampering rescue efforts. Authorities say 131 people are still unaccounted for and 155,000 are homeless. And Hong Kong's appeal court has granted an application by the government to ban a protest anthem named Glory to Hong Kong, overturning a lower court judgment last year that had rejected the bid, citing free speech concerns. The ruling comes as critics highlight concern for the erosion in Hong Kong of the rule of law and individual rights, following a sweeping national security crackdown by China's Communist Party leaders. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Vincent.
Thank you, Carlotta. Well, next we turn to Japan, where Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has just returned from a diplomatic trip to Brazil and Paraguay. It has been nearly a decade since a Japanese leader visited the region. Let's get the latest on this with Monocle's Tokyo bureau chief and Asia editor, Fiona Wilson. Good afternoon, Fiona. Tell us about this trip and why it was important for Kishida to visit the region.
Hi, yeah, thanks. It certainly was important. I mean, as you mentioned, he hasn't been there. He hasn't been there as he's been Prime Minister. Shinzo Abe was the last Prime Minister to make a speech there, and that was a decade ago. You know, clearly a lot has changed geopolitically in the last 10 years. And I think the biggest change has been just the rise of China, its massive influence on Latin America, biggest trading partner. It outperforms America now. So I think in a sense, Japan, it's overdue. Japan wants to go, and Kishida needed to go in person. He gave a speech in Sao Paulo and he talked about the long connection, the 3 million people with Japanese ancestry in the region. And then he talked a lot about how Japan's trade would be slightly different. Now, he didn't mention China by name, but he talked about all the sort of words that he's been using a lot in Southeast Asia: trust, partnership, collaboration. This is not about aid as some kind of, way of coercing. He talked about coercion, keeping international order open. So it was an interesting approach.
You mentioned China there. I was recently in Mexico City earlier this month. I know that's Central America, but I was really taken aback by the number of Chinese EVs I saw, particularly BYD. Is that something that we're seeing in South America that Japan's worried about, the cutting into that market share?
Yeah, I think the reality is that Japan knows it can't really compete with China, as an economic partner. So what it's saying is, let's do things together. Kishida, I don't know if you remember, but Japan hosted the G7 in 2023. Japan invited, that was in Hiroshima, Japan invited Brazil to be there on the sidelines, even though it's not part of the G7. It invited India, Indonesia. Kishida's been talking for a while, actually, about the importance of the global south, as he calls it, and saying it can't be left behind. And I think what he's trying to say is, he's very careful not to make these countries pick, because obviously when it comes down to it, Brazil is not going to turn its back on China. But what he's saying is we can offer something different. And I think what he talks about is quality infrastructure. And I think generally when you look at Japan's overseas budget now, in terms of development, its budget has flatlined. Its peak was about 1997. It's not what it was. So the current Japanese approach is to go in with private companies. And Kishida was with about 40 different companies. And to make these agreements, I mean, I think they signed 38 agreements in Brazil. It was all sorts of things, they're interested in climate change. So it was energy, technical support. It was all sorts of issues that what Kishida is doing is trying to play to Japan's strengths.
Well, he met with both President Lula da Silva of Brazil and President Santiago Pena of Paraguay. Do we know what else came out of these summits with them?
Well, apart from anything, it's a very long way from Japan. So to go there is in itself a big effort. And, President Lula, Brazil is the chair of the G20. So I think it's important for Japan to be in there, and I think Kishida's always keen to get into the diplomatic mix. I think the policy that he's trying to pursue, which has been very successful in Southeast Asia, is it's much more about soft power. It's not about insisting that people trade with Japan or else. And I think he's trying to show there is a different way of doing trade from Japan. And when you look at, Kishida has sort of reworked all the big Japan approaches to defense, security, but he's also looked again at the way official development assistance happens. So that's another sort of plank of his diplomatic approach is to do a kind of, it does involve a lot of money, but it's a lot of private funding as well. So it's beneficial to the country's economic growth, beneficial to Japan. And then he did repeatedly talk, as he often does, about a sort of international order, free and open society. This is all coded way of saying that China is anything but. And it's saying that Japan can offer this much more open, collaborative approach.
And how is the trip being perceived back home?
Well, I think, Kishida is in a very, very tight, difficult spot, to be honest, in Japan at the moment. His ratings are really bad as they've been. And it's actually nothing to do with the trip to Latin America. But for reasons at home, he's got this big political funding scandal, which has been going on for months now. The public doesn't feel he's handled it properly. It's about funds being misused by his own party, not by him personally, but people feel he hasn't really got a handle on it. So he's trying to do these trips and saying, look, I'm out there, supporting Japan. But I think really he's in a difficult position and his ratings are very difficult. And I think it's not going to be enough to do these successful trips. And I think it was deemed to be a successful trip. But the minute he came back, he was being questioned about this political scandal in Japan. So I think it's very, very difficult. I think the trading sector of the economy will be happy with what happened in Brazil and Paraguay. But the general public still feels that Kishida is not doing a good job in terms of this political scandal.
And part of diplomacy is obviously winning over hearts and minds. In the past decade, South Korea has done incredible with the likes of K-pop and expanding its culture and building sort of these links around the world. Japan has potentially fallen slightly back on that. Is that going to be a priority, do you think, to keep the South America sort of in sort of good relations?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because you're absolutely right. I think, being here in Japan and seeing all these visitors coming to Japan, there's an incredible appetite for Japanese culture. And I do slightly feel the Japanese government doesn't quite know what to do with that soft power at the moment. They're very aware of the massive power of manga, anime, pop music, not so much for Japan. Korean music's massive here as well. And I think that really has not been coming up in any of these discussions. It's much more, it's cold kind of business and trade. And I think that is something that really they need to look at. It needs a politician, Taro Aso, who's been in politics forever in Kishida's party. He's a big sort of advocate for Japan's soft power on the popular culture front. But I think Japan is aware it's slightly missing a trick, and it's seen, Hayao Miyazaki, who just won an Oscar for his latest film. And there is plenty of potential. That didn't come up, but I'm sure it will.
Fiona Wilson in Tokyo, thank you very much. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio.
The Foreign Desk is Monocle Radio's weekly world affairs programme. We tackle the biggest global news stories, as well as those too often left untold.
I've been out on the streets of Lagos. People are unable to withdraw their cash. Fights have broken out in banking halls.
As well as the occasional retelling of events from days long past.
The gates opened and in came this horse, absolutely huge, made of wood. People were asking, what's it for? Is it some kind of icon?
Our expert guests offer in-depth analysis and first-hand experience.
There were a lot of diplomatic efforts by NATO and NATO allies. We really made big efforts to convince Russia not to invade.
The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller, is available every Saturday from midday London time, right here on Monocle Radio.
You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, a roundup of the latest business news. We're joined by Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Ewan, soaring rents are proving a problem in the fight against inflation.
Yeah, how far we've won that battle against inflation is the key question for economists and policymakers at central banks around the world. But one thing is proving a big problem for them, and that is rising rents. It looks like the disinflation momentum we've seen through much of last year has stalled in a number of economies, and that's leading to pushback on when we can cut interest rates. At the beginning of the year, we thought the US was going to cut rates quite rapidly. It's now looking like they may only cut rates once or twice this year. Some saying that may not even happen. In Australia, which has a particularly big problem with this, there's even talk of a rate rise at some point. So the US, the UK, Canada and Australia are all seeing rapidly rising housing costs. And of course, housing is a very big component of the inflation basket. Now, the danger is that workers will demand bigger pay rises to deal with this cost of living squeeze. It's less of an issue in continental Europe, but it's worse in countries with rapid immigration and with building shortages. Australia is somewhere where both of those things are the case. In Australia, rents are rising at an annual rate of 7.7%. It's the highest level in 30 years. Excluding housing, Australia's annual inflation is now down to 3.2%. That's quite close to the central bank's target. But inflation in housing costs is proving very sticky. Also a problem here in the UK as well. UK rents are up by almost a fifth since 2022 and rising at their fastest pace on record. Partly that's because of prospective homeowners being driven back into renting because they can't afford higher mortgage rates. But it is a big problem for the Bank of England. We're going to find out what they do to interest rates with their decision, which comes tomorrow. Widely expected to leave it on hold. Economists say it's just too soon to say if inflation has been tamed in the UK.
And governments don't want people asking for pay rises. But one thing they could do to intervene is perhaps get into this market. Do you think we could be seeing proposals for rent caps starting to emerge?
Well, of course, they have been introduced in a number of economies around the world. Economists are resolute. They're united that these are a bad idea. They say that you can't fix the price of things. And if you do, it has all sorts of unintended consequences. But we have one in place here in the UK, in Scotland. It's not something which the governments at Westminster have gone ahead with. And of course, it's well known that many parts of Germany have tackled these as well. It is very useful if you already are in a property or you've got a long-term tenancy. It keeps the increases lower, but it can cause problems for those people who want to find a new flat because it does tend to reduce the supply of properties coming onto the market. Landlords say, well, if I can't get a decent return, I'm going to sell up. I'm not going to bother renting out my property. So that reduces the supply, and then that causes a bigger problem if there's a lot of demand, which presumably there is. Otherwise, you wouldn't cap rents in the first place. So it's a simple solution, but it's one that economists say has a lot of unintended consequences.
And I was in a clothing store yesterday and was really struck that all the tags seem to suggest for just any item of clothing, you could sort of do a pay in installments. And there's a simmering row over this buy now, pay later model for products, isn't there?
That's really interesting that you see that on the high street as well, because it is incredibly prevalent online. And there's a bit of a row, as you say, over the levels of debt being carried by consumers. We've seen consumer spending in the US particularly hold up incredibly well in the face of inflation pressures. Part of that is a hangover from the pandemic. People have a lot of savings built up, but also some of it is running up debt. And we know that debt levels have been rising. And the trouble with buy now, pay later debt, this is offered by companies like Klarna and Afterpay. When you get to the checkout online, you can choose to pay in 4 easy installments, 0 interest, and it doesn't affect your credit rating either. The problem for markets is that we just don't know how much of this debt is around. There are estimates that the market could be worth some $700 billion globally by 2028, but that is an estimate. And economists just don't know how much debt Americans or any other nationalities are carrying of this stuff. And there's also a row between the companies and the credit reference agencies. The companies say that the credit reference agencies are not ready to take their data, and also it could risk harming consumers' credit scores. And the agencies themselves, TransUnion, Experian and Equifax, say that they're ready to take the data. So this is a bit of a row over whether and how this data should be transferred. I think more regulation is coming down the line, but that's a little way off. In the meantime, American consumers and consumers ever are carrying on spending.
Ewan Potts, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio.
Become a Monocle magazine subscriber today and enjoy 10% off any annual subscription. It's time to get a truly global view that's upbeat and optimistic. With a global roster of correspondents and bureau, we deliver stories that you won't find elsewhere. Expect insights on everything from diplomacy and design to art and architecture, and more. Sign up today and you'll receive 10 issues and seasonal specials full of inspiration. Visit monocle.com/subscribe and enter the code radio10 to redeem this offer.
And finally, Swiss Army knives come in all sorts of configurations, but across their range, the actual small knife has always been the anchor of the multi-purpose tool. But now, due in part to legislation in countries like Britain restricting knives in public, Victorinox, the company behind the famous gadget, is working on a model without a blade. Well, let's cross over to our Zurich studio to get more on this with a long-standing member of our base in the city, Carlo Silberschmidt, Senior Account Manager at creative agency Wink Creative, joins me now. Carlo, tell us about what will actually be in this new model then.
We don't know yet, actually. It's not been released yet, but we heard there are plans to remove the actual blade from the legendary Victorinox. Not on all models, but maybe on a special edition for the UK.
And would it still be called a Swiss Army knife? Is there an alternate brand being pitched around?
Actually, Victorinox experimented with various formats that kind of geared away from this typical knife format in the past. And if you look online, you can find models with forks, you can find USB sticks. So there's definitely something for everyone. But I would actually argue that most Swiss don't actually use the blade on the Swiss knife. They use the wine screw to open a bottle of wine with their Swiss Army knife.
And how much of a soft power symbol are the devices for Switzerland?
I would actually say it's true. The knife is less present. The term Swiss Army knife is almost used more in business than people would actually refer to the actual tool. And I almost feel like maybe tennis shoes, tennis stars have taken the global stage in the last few years.
And in terms of the business itself, it has faced sort of big challenges before. Obviously, legislation stopped knives now being one. But I mean, 9/11 had an impact on it, didn't it? I can remember, Swiss Army knife was something you would regularly see in the sort of duty-free catalogue when you were flying on a plane. But that's all sort of disappeared now.
On one hand, yes, but I think we're quite relaxed here in Switzerland about it all and our national symbol. You can actually still find it on lots of airports, and you're actually allowed to still carry it on a plane. So let's see in a few years whether this is just something that's coming from the UK and might fade away, or if it's a long-term change.
And Carlo, finally, a bit of a gear shift here, but Fernando Augusto Pacheco has just walked into the gallery. We're doing a countdown tomorrow on Eurovision, and we're told one of the top 5 contenders is Switzerland's song by a sort of singer-rapper called Nemo. I'm not sure if you've heard it, but are you backing your chances this year at all?
There's a lot of excitement in Switzerland. We know that competition is very, very tough, but let's see what happens this weekend.
Carlo Silberschmidt in Zurich, thank you very much. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Carlotta Rebello. Our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Steph Chung-gu. The Briefing is back at the same time tomorrow. You can find past episodes on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to come back on anything you've heard on the show today, do drop me an email, vm@monocle.com. I'm Vincent McAviney. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.